The nib of the pen scratched against the paper, a sound as final as a spade striking dry earth. Abigail Rose held her breath. The scent of dust and her father's lingering debts thick in the Kansas air. The name on the marriage contract, Eli McKenna, was a stranger's map to an unknown world, Colorado Territory, a place drawn in sharp lines and tall shadows, so different from the endless flat horizon that had been her entire life. She signed her name, the ink a dark little boat set adrift on a sea of hope and desperation. In her small trunk, packed with 2 calico dresses and her mother's book of remedies, lay a simple wedding veil. It was already tinged with the dust of the road she had yet to travel, a promise no longer pure white, but stained with the grit of necessity. Silver Gulch was not a town that whispered, it roared, after days rattling in a stagecoach that seemed determined to acquaint her with every bone in her body. Abigail stepped out into a blast of wind that carried the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the high, thin laughter from a saloon, and the smell of pine, sweat, and simmering stew. The mountains, the San Juans, were not a gentle backdrop. They were a wall of jagged rock and dark timber that clawed at the sky, making the raw, half-finished town at their feet seem temporary, an impudent camp that could be swept away by the first serious snow. The meeting place was the Coles Mercantile, a long log building that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and damp wool. Ben Cole, a man with a barrel chest and a kind, wrinkled smile, took her offered letter. His wife, Hattie, a woman whose hands were never still, pressed a cup of hot, bitter coffee into Abigail's cold fingers. Eli McKenna, Ben said, reading the name. He looked at Hattie, a silent conversation passing between them in a single glance. Well now, you've come a long way, Miss. Abigail, she corrected softly. Abigail, Hattie repeated, her voice warm. Eli's a good man. Quiet. Ben nodded, stoking his pipe. A man of few words, but he keeps them. Pays in cash, too. He said it like a benediction, the highest praise a man could earn in a town built on credit and speculation. They spoke of him as if he were a force of nature, like a river or a winter storm, dependable, formidable, and best not trifled with. They did not speak of him as a husband. He came an hour later, appearing in the doorway without a sound. Eli McKenna was not a tall man, but he was built of the same dense, solid material as the mountains he called home. His hair was dark, his face browned and weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke more of watchfulness than laughter. He moved with a quiet economy, his gaze taking in everything Abigail, the Coles, the layout of the store, the street outside. It was not a suspicious look, but a deeply observant one. He held out a hand, not to shake hers, but to take her trunk. Miss Rose. His voice was low, a gravelly sound like stones shifting in a creek bed. Mr. McKenna, she replied, her own voice feeling small and thin in the vastness of this new country. The journey to Aspen Hollow began in a sturdy buckboard wagon pulled by 2 stout mules. As they climbed out of the ragged gash of Silver Gulch, the air grew colder, cleaner. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, merely vast. Eli seemed to be listening to the world around them, the snap of a twig in the forest, the cry of a hawk circling high above, the rhythm of the mule's hooves on the rocky trail. Abigail, in turn, watched him, this man who was now her husband by law, though they had not even stood before a preacher. They were deep in a narrow pass, the granite walls rising steeply on either side. When it happened, 3 riders appeared behind them, moving with a lazy confidence that was more menacing than speed. They were hard men, the kind whose faces were a ledger of bad choices and worse intentions. Eli did not look back. His eyes were fixed on the trail ahead, but Abigail saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. He did not reach for the rifle resting by his side. He simply flicked the reins. Ha! The mules picked up their pace. The riders followed, closing the distance. One of them called out, his voice swallowed by the canyon. "McKenna, we just want to talk." Eli did not answer. He guided the wagon around a sharp bend. Ahead, the trail was choked by a recent rock slide, a jumble of boulders and scree. It looked impassable. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. They were trapped. But Eli guided the mules not towards the blockage, but to a barely visible track that veered sharply up the canyon wall. It was a path meant for goats, not a wagon. The buckboard tilted at a terrifying angle. Abigail gripped the seat, certain they would tumble into the ravine below. Eli's hands on the reins were steady, his voice a low, calming murmur to the animals. They scrambled up the incline, wheels spinning, and emerged onto a higher ledge. Below, the three riders reined in their horses, staring at the rock slide and then up at the wagon, their faces masks of frustration. They were cut off. Eli did not pause to look at them. He kept the mules moving until the pass was far behind them. The silence returned, now heavier than before. Finally, Abigail found her voice. "Who were they?" He looked at the path ahead. "Just men. They knew your name. They were following us." "This is a big country," he said, the words offering no explanation at all. "But it ain't that big." It was the first wall she had come up against with him, a silence that was not vast but solid, a door deliberately closed. The seed of mystery, planted in the dusty soil of Silver Gulch, had begun to sprout. Aspen Hollow was not a hollow at all, but a small, high meadow cradled by tall peaks and groves of shimmering aspen trees. The cabin was larger than she expected, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney breathing a steady plume of white smoke into the crisp air. It was a house that had been built to last, to stand against the wind and the snow. But it was the inside that truly stunned her. She had expected a bachelor's rough-dwelling dirt floors, unwashed dishes, the smell of stale whiskey and solitude. Instead, the cabin was immaculate. The pine floor was swept clean. A neat stack of firewood sat by the hearth. On a long wooden table, 3 tin plates and cups were set for a meal. A large cast-iron pot simmered over the fire, filling the room with a savory aroma of beans and bacon. And then she saw them. They emerged from a back room, 3 silent children who moved with the same quiet watchfulness as their father, a girl of about 10, with long, dark braids and serious eyes, held the hand of a small, round-faced toddler. A boy of 7 or so stood slightly behind them, his gaze darting from Abigail to Eli. Eli took off his hat. "Abigail," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "this is May, this is Jonah, and this is Little Bird." The children did not smile. They simply looked at her, their faces unreadable. Abigail stood frozen in the doorway, the cold mountain air at her back and the warmth of a life she had never imagined before her. 3 children. No one had mentioned 3 children. The contract had been for a wife. It had said nothing about a mother. She looked from the children to the neat cabin, her mind racing. The clean kitchen, the waiting meal. He had been raising them alone, and from the looks of it, for a long time. Later, as she helped May serve the bean stew, she surveyed the kitchen again. Everything had its place. The knives were sharp. The cast-iron skillets seasoned and hung in order of size. It was more organized than her own mother's kitchen had ever been. "You cook," she said to Eli, the words coming out with a surprise that bordered on accusation. "And you are cleaner than I am." Eli looked up from helping Little Bird with her spoon. A flicker of something, perhaps humor, touched the corner of his mouth. "Up on a mountain," he said, his voice that low rumble. "No church bell wakes a man. An empty stomach does." In the days that followed, Abigail found her footing in the rhythms of the cabin. She learned the weight of the axe for splitting kindling, the particular heat of the wood stove, the way the wind sang through the pines just before a storm. She also learned the children, May, who was fiercely protective of her younger siblings and read from a tattered primer with a solemn intensity. Jonah, who rarely spoke but saw everything, and could track a deer through the woods with a skill that belied his age, and Little Bird, whose laughter, when it finally came, was like the sudden, unexpected warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds. A week later, they needed supplies. The journey down to Silver Gulch felt different. Abigail now sat straighter on the wagon seat, the mountains no longer a terrifying wall, but the familiar contours of home. But in the town, the air had changed. She felt the stares, heard the whispers that died as she passed. At the Mercantile, Hattie Cole was still warm, but a sadness had crept into her eyes. "There's talk," Hattie said quietly, while Eli was loading sacks of flour. "Folks wondering about the children." The whispers followed them outside, ugly and sharp-edged. Mountain Man and his half-breed kids. The words were spoken just loud enough to be heard. Abigail saw Eli's shoulders stiffen, but his expression did not change. He lifted a heavy sack as if he had heard nothing but the wind. The truth, however, had a way of finding you, even at 8,000 feet. It arrived in the form of Marshal Silas Pike. He found them just as they were about to leave. His horse, a fine, sleek animal that stood out amongst the dusty ponies and mules. The marshal himself was just as sleek, his black coat unwrinkled, his silver star polished to a high shine. He was handsome, with a politician's easy smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. "McKenna," he said, tipping his hat. He then turned his full attention to Abigail. "And this must be the new bride. Welcome to Silver Gulch, ma'am. I trust you are settling in well." "I am, thank you, Marshal," Abigail replied, her hand instinctively tightening on the wagon seat. "It is a sudden arrangement," Pike continued, his tone conversational, but his eyes were sharp, probing. A man like McKenna, living so far out, and with his responsibilities. It must have come as quite a surprise. Eli stepped between them, placing the last sack in the buckboard. His presence was not aggressive, but it was absolute. It blocked the marshal's view of Abigail. "The lady is tired. Marshal, we'll be heading up." Pike's smile tightened. He looked from Eli's stony face to the quiet, watchful children in the back of the wagon. "Of course, we must all tend to our responsibilities." He held Eli's gaze for a long moment. A silent battle of wills fought in the dusty main street. Then he tipped his hat again and rode away. That night, after the children were asleep in their loft beds, a profound quiet settled over the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The questions that had been simmering in Abigail's mind for days finally boiled over. The bounty hunters, the whispers, the marshal's pointed words. She turned to Eli, who was mending a leather strap by the firelight, his hands strong and sure. In his lap was a small deerskin pouch she had seen him with before. As he worked, it fell open, and for a moment she saw what was inside 3 small, smooth stones of brilliant blue-green turquoise. He quickly closed the pouch and tucked it away. "Eli," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Those men in the pass, the talk in town, the marshal, it is all connected to the children, is not it?" He continued his work, his focus on the needle and thread absolute. He did not look at her. Who was their mother, she pressed, the question raw and essential. "Where is she?" Eli pulled the stitch tight. He set the mended strap down. He looked into the fire, his face a mask of shadows and secrets. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing, a wall between them thicker than any log in the cabin. He would not answer. 2 days later, she walked the 2 miles to see the only other soul who lived in the vicinity of Aspen Hollow, Dr. Mercy. His cabin was a chaotic jumble of books, drying herbs, and glass bottles. The doctor was an old man, stooped and cynical, but his eyes were sharp. He listened as she spoke, not of bounty hunters or marshals, but of her difficulty in treating Little Bird's persistent cough. As he measured out some dried mullein leaf into a piece of brown paper, he looked at her over the top of his spectacles. "The mountain air is hard on little lungs," he said. Then he paused, his gaze softening. "It is a heavy load for a girl of 18. Abigail did not pretend to misunderstand. "I just want to know what I have walked into. Doctor—" He sighed, a weary, rattling sound. He handed her the herbs. "Out here, Abigail," he said, his voice raspy but kind. "You learn to read the signs, the weather, the tracks of an animal, the quiet of a man who has too much to say." He looked her straight in the eye. "Out here, silence is an answer, too." She walked back to the cabin with the herbs in her hand and his words echoing in her mind. The wind was picking up, carrying the first real bite of winter. The smoke from her chimney was a thin, steady line rising into the vast, indifferent sky. She was a wife, but not a wife. She was a mother, but not a mother. She was part of a family bound not by blood or by vows, but by a secret she was beginning to understand was as dangerous as any blizzard gathering on the peaks above. The rhythm of the mountain became the rhythm of her life. Abigail learned that sunrise was not a suggestion but a command, painting the eastern peaks in hues of rose and violet before spilling into the valley. She learned the heft of the axe, the satisfying thud as the steel bit into pine, and the ache in her shoulders that followed. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and capable. She mastered the art of the cast-iron pot, coaxing nourishing stews and hearty breads from its smoky depths, understanding that this heavy, black vessel was the true heart of their home, the anchor of their survival. Her days were measured in small, essential tasks. She would sit with May by the fire, their heads bent over the primer, the older girl's finger tracing the letters as she painstakingly sounded out words. May was a solemn student, absorbing knowledge with a quiet hunger that touched Abigail's heart. With Jonah, lessons were different. He had no patience for books, but he could tally a cord of wood or calculate the remaining stores of flour with a swift, practical intelligence. Abigail taught him his sums using pebbles and twigs, turning the forest floor into their slate. For Little Bird, the lessons were a game. Abigail would spread dried beans on the rough wooden table, arranging them into the shapes of letters, and the little girl's giggles would fill the cabin as she spelled out simple words like cat and zun. In these quiet moments, Abigail felt the fragile roots of a new life taking hold. She learned to mend Eli's buckskin trousers, her stitches neat and even. Once, while he was sharpening an axe, the blade slipped, laying open a deep gash across his forearm. He came into the cabin without a word, blood dripping onto the clean floor. Abigail's breath caught, but the years of watching her mother tend to farm injuries took over. She washed the wound, her touch gentle but firm, and stitched it closed with a horsehair thread, just as she had seen done 100 times. She bound it with clean linen and a poultice of yarrow to ward off infection. Eli watched her the entire time, his expression unreadable, his silence a heavy cloak. He did not thank her, but when he went back outside, he moved his arm with a carefulness that acknowledged her skill. She was no longer just the woman who had signed a piece of paper. She was a necessary part of this small, isolated world. A month after her arrival, the town of Silver Gulch held its autumn market, a boisterous affair that drew in miners, trappers, and ranchers from 100 miles around. Eli needed to sell a stack of prime beaver pelts, and they needed winter supplies. The journey down felt different. Abigail felt a flicker of pride as she sat beside Eli, the children safely bundled in the back of the wagon. She belonged here, in this wild, beautiful place. The town, however, had not forgotten its suspicions. Silver Gulch thrived on gossip as much as it did on gold, and the McKenna family was a rich vein to be mined. As Abigail moved through the crowded stalls, a group of off-duty miners, their faces still smudged with coal dust, blocked her path. They were loud and smelled of cheap whiskey and sweat. "Well, look here," one of them sneered, his eyes roving over her. "It is the mountain man's little mail-order bride." Another one laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Heard he had a whole litter of pups up there. You the new kennel keeper." The insult, crude and sharp, was aimed at the children. Abigail felt a hot flash of anger, so fierce it surprised her. She thought of May's serious face bent over her book, of Jonah's quiet competence, of Little Bird's bright, infectious laugh. These were not a litter of pups. They were children. Her children. The thought rose in her mind, unbidden and absolute. She drew herself up to her full height, which was not very tall, but her spine was straight and her gaze was level. She looked the first man directly in the eye. A small, cold smile touched her lips. "I may only be 18, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying over the market noise. "But I spent my whole life learning how to weigh things. I know how to weigh medicine, and I know how to weigh a man. And from where I am standing, you are coming up short." For a moment, there was stunned silence. The miners stared at her, their crude smirks frozen on their faces. Then, from the crowd, a ripple of laughter started, not at her, but at them. The men, red-faced and suddenly clumsy, shuffled their feet and melted back into the throng. Abigail stood her ground for a second longer, her heart pounding, before turning away with a dignity she had not known she possessed. She did not see Eli step out from behind a nearby stall, a bale of hay in his arms, his eyes fixed on her with an expression of quiet, profound surprise. The wildness of the land was a constant presence, a neighbor that could be beautiful one moment and deadly the next. One night, they were woken by a frantic squawking and a splintering crash from the direction of the chicken coop. Eli was out of his bed in an instant, rifle in hand. Abigail was right behind him, pulling a heavy shawl over her nightdress. In the pale moonlight, they saw the devastation. The coop door was torn from its leather hinges. A massive black bear was inside, swatting at the terrified chickens. It was a terrifying sight, a force of raw, untamed nature. Eli raised his rifle, but he hesitated. A shot in the dark was risky, and a wounded bear was more dangerous than a hungry one. "We need to scare it off," he said in a low voice. Abigail's mind, honed by years of practical problem-solving, raced. "Noise," she whispered. A frightening noise. Her eyes fell on a pile of empty tin cans near the woodshed and the sack of dried corn they used for feed. An idea, born of desperation and farmyard tricks, sparked in her mind. Working together in the shadows, they moved with a silent, synchronized purpose. She filled a large can with a handful of hard, dried corn kernels. Eli found a length of rawhide and tied it securely to the can, while he crept around to the far side of the coop. She stayed near the cabin, her heart in her throat. Eli let out a sharp whistle. The bear, startled, lifted its massive head from the coop, sniffing the air. At that exact moment, Abigail, following their hastily made plan, hurled the tin can into the rocky clearing between the bear and the forest. It landed with a clatter, and the corn inside created a loud, dry, rattling sound that echoed eerily in the night. It sounded exactly like the warning of a very large, very angry rattlesnake. The bear froze. It was a primal sound, a warning that was older than mountains. The great beast grunted, swung its head back and forth, and then, with a surprising burst of speed, it crashed off into the woods, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a lingering, musky scent. They stood in the moonlight for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly seeping away. The silence of the forest rushed back in. Abigail looked at the ridiculous tin can lying in the dirt. Eli looked at her. A slow grin spread across his face, a rare and wonderful thing that completely transformed his weathered features. And then she began to laugh. A real, helpless, belly-deep laugh of relief and sheer absurdity. He joined in, his laughter a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. It was the first time they had truly laughed together, a shared moment of victory over the wild, forged in the moonlight with a tin can and a handful of corn. In that sound, the wall of silence between them developed its first real crack. But secrets, like roots, run deep and can break through the hardest ground. A few days later, while cleaning the cabin, Abigail was tidying a small stack of Eli's papers on a high shelf. Tucked within a ledger of fur sales was a folded, unsent letter. Her hand stilled. She knew she should not look, that it was his private business, but Dr. Mercy's words about silence being an answer echoed in her ears. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. The letter was not addressed to anyone. It was more like a collection of notes, written in Eli's strong, spare hand. The words leaped off the page, stark and dangerous. Lone Mesa. Remember what happened? The Devil's Wash incident cannot be buried. Pike knows I was there. He is looking for the map of the railroad boundary stakes. Proof of the claim fraud. Must keep it safe. For them. Abigail read the lines again and again, the words burning themselves into her memory. Lone Mesa, Devil's Wash, railroad boundary stakes, and Pike, Marshall Pike. It was all there, a dark and tangled story she could only see the edges of. The last two words, for them, hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. For May, Jonah, and Little Bird. This was not just about a piece of land, it was about protecting the children from a past that was hunting them. She carefully folded the letter and put it back exactly where she had found it, her mind a whirlwind of fear and suspicion. The warmth of their shared laughter a few nights before now felt like a fragile, distant memory. That evening, the distance had returned, a quiet and heavy thing. Eli seemed to sense her turmoil. After the children were asleep, he did not turn to his usual mending or carving. He sat by the fire, poking at the embers. They like your stories, Abigail said softly, breaking the silence. It was true, in the evenings, he would sometimes gather the children and tell them tales, not from books, but from memory. Stories of clever coyotes and brave eagles, of the changing of the seasons, of stars that were the campfires of ancient spirits. When he spoke to them, his voice lost its gravelly edge, becoming a gentle, mesmerizing cadence that would eventually lull them to sleep. He had a gift for it, a storyteller's heart hidden beneath his stoic exterior. He looked up, his eyes catching the firelight. My father told them to me. It was the most he had ever offered about his own past. He fell silent again, but the quiet felt different now, less like a wall and more like a deep, still pool of water. Abigail watched him, this man of contradictions, this man who could face down a bear and tell stories to children, who could fight off armed men and keep a spotless kitchen, who was her husband but still a stranger. She walked to the window and looked out into the vast, dark expanse of the valley. The moon was a silver sliver, and the stars were a cold, brilliant spray across the blackness. And then she saw it, far below, near the dark line of the pass leading to Silver Gulch, was a tiny pinprick of light. A campfire. It was too small and too isolated to be from a prospector's camp. It was a watcher's fire. A thin, almost invisible trail of blue-tinged smoke rose from it. A deliberate signal in the clear night air. They were being observed. The law of the forest had given way once more to the law of men, and Abigail knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the fight for this family had only just begun. The watcher's fire did not return, but the feeling of being watched remained. It was a subtle pressure on the back of the neck, a stillness in the woods that felt unnatural. Abigail learned to live with it, just as she had learned to live with the altitude and the ever-present wind. She moved through her days with a deliberate purpose, finding a strange and fragile peace in the routine of survival. Yet, beneath the surface of her new life, the words from Eli's unsent letter churned Lone Mesa, Devil's Wash, Railroad, Pike. They were the cornerstones of a secret edifice, and she was living in its shadow. The shadow took on a solid form 2 weeks later. It was a bright, cold afternoon, the kind where the sky is a painful, brilliant blue and the air is so thin it feels sharp in the lungs. Abigail was on the porch, showing Jonah how to properly fletch an arrow with grouse feathers, when she saw the rider coming up the trail. It was not Eli, who was checking his trap lines to the north. This man rode a fine black horse and sat in his saddle with an easy arrogance. It was Marshal Silas Pike. Abigail's hand froze over the arrow shaft. She sent Jonah inside with a quiet command. "Go help May with the mending. Now." The boy vanished without a word, his small face tight with an awareness beyond his years. Abigail remained on the porch, her hands resting on the rough wooden rail, forcing herself to appear calm. Pike reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the homestead, taking in the neat stacks of firewood, the sturdy construction of the cabin, the well-tended garden patch now cleared for winter. It was the look of a man appraising property, not visiting a neighbor. "Good afternoon, Mrs. McKenna," he said, swinging down from his horse. He removed his hat, revealing perfectly combed hair. His smile was a polished and practiced thing. "I was in the area and thought I would pay my respects. See that you are faring well in our mountain wilderness." "We are well, Marshal," Abigail replied, her voice even. "My husband is not here." "A pity," Pike said, though he did not sound disappointed. He let his gaze drift towards the shimmering aspen grove that gave the hollow its name. "This is a beautiful piece of land. A bit isolated, perhaps, but beautiful. Prime timber, good water." He paused, looking directly at her. "And it sits right in the path of progress." Abigail said nothing, her knuckles white where she gripped the rail. "A new cattle trail is being planned. Coming down from the high country," he continued, his tone turning confidential, as if sharing a wonderful secret. "And there is talk, serious talk, of a railroad spur from Silver Gulch. It would bring prosperity. Mrs. McKenna, it would tame this wild country. A man with a holding like this could stand to make a great deal of money. Or," he added, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly, "he could stand in the way." He took a step closer to the porch, his smile gone, his eyes cold and hard as river stones. "Your husband is a stubborn man. He has a complicated history with this part of the territory. He seems to believe this land is his to keep, regardless of the needs of the community, the demands of the future. That is an unwise position to take." He looked past her, towards the cabin door where the children were undoubtedly watching, hidden in the shadows, especially for a man with so much to lose. The threat was unmistakable, a coil of venom wrapped in the language of civic duty. He was not just after the land. He was using the children as a lever. The anger that had flared in her at the market now returned as a cold, protective fury. "My husband provides for his family, Marshal," she said, her voice low and clear. "And we protect what is ours. The future can find another path." Pike's eyes narrowed. He had expected a frightened young woman, not this quiet defiance. He held her gaze for a moment, then put his hat back on, the easy smile returning as if from a great distance. "You are a loyal wife. I commend you for it, but loyalty can be a heavy burden to carry. Give Eli my regards." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a profound silence in his wake. When Eli returned at dusk, Abigail told him everything. He listened without interruption, his face impassive, but she saw the firelight glint on the tight cords of muscle in his neck. He simply nodded, went outside, and spent the next hour sharpening his axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel the only answer he offered. A few days later, a trip to Silver Gulch became unavoidable. The blade of Eli's favorite skinning knife had been chipped, and only one man in town had the skill to repair it properly. Old Crow, the Cheyenne blacksmith, worked in a dark, smoky forge at the edge of town, far from the main street. He was a man who seemed as ancient as the mountains themselves, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes holding a deep, sorrowful wisdom. He took the knife from Eli, examining the damaged blade with a practiced eye. "A stone is patient," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It waits for the steel to make a mistake." While he worked the bellows, bringing the coal to a glowing red heat, His gaze fell upon Abigail, who was standing quietly in the shadows of the forge. He had seen her in town before, but had never spoken to her. He looked from her to Eli, who was watching the children as they played with a stray dog just outside the door. Old Crow placed the tip of the knife into the fire. "You have a good hand with them," he said, not looking at her. "They are growing straight." "They are good children," Abigail replied softly. The blacksmith nodded, his eyes on the glowing steel. He worked in silence for a few minutes, the hiss of the fire and the clang of his hammer filling the small space. When the blade was reshaped and cooling in a trough of dark water, he looked at her again, a deep, knowing look that seemed to see right through her. "The little bird," he said, nodding his head slightly towards the outside where little bird's laughter could be heard. "She was not born in this nest, but she sings the right tune." The words struck Abigail with the force of a physical blow. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He knew. He was confirming the great, unspoken truth of their family. She felt a wave of dizziness, the heat of the forge suddenly overwhelming. She looked at Eli, but he was still watching the children, his back to them, either not having heard or pretending not to. Old Crow handed the repaired knife back to Eli, their hands brushing in a gesture of long familiarity. No more was said. The ride back to Aspen Hollow was silent, but for Abigail, the silence was screaming. She looked at the back of Eli's head, at the strong set of his shoulders. She felt a roiling storm of emotions inside her. There was gratitude for this life, for the safety and purpose she had found here. She was no longer a commodity to be sold to pay a debt. She was a vital, working part of this household. But there was also a deep and burning anger. He had brought her into a war without telling her the enemy's name. He had made her a mother to children whose history was a dangerous secret. He trusted her with his home, his children's well-being, even his own wounds. But he did not trust her with the truth. The question repeated itself in her mind. A painful refrain: was she a wife on paper, or a wife in this home? The distinction felt more important than ever. The situation came to a head a week later. The weather was turning, the sky a leaden gray, the wind carrying the sharp, metallic scent of snow. A rider approached, moving at a fast, steady trot. It was not Pike. This was a woman, dressed in practical buckskins, a rifle scabbarded at her side. She was lean and weathered, with dark, intelligent eyes and a calm, capable air. Eli met her in the yard. "Luce," he said, his voice holding a note of relief and concern. "Eli," she replied. Swinging down from her horse, she nodded respectfully to Abigail. "Ma'am, this was Luce Ortega, a ranger for the territory, though most of her work was done far from the eyes of her superiors. She was a friend, an ally. She did not waste time with pleasantries. Things are moving in Silver Gulch," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Kincaid has brought in a new group of men, not miners, hard cases. They are calling themselves a land surveyors, but they are bounty hunters. Eli, the same kind that were here before." Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Amos Kincaid was the cattle baron who owned half the territory, a man whose name was always spoken in the same breath as power and ruthlessness. Luce's next words were even colder. "And that is not all. They spent all yesterday morning at the gallows, cleaning it, oiling the trap. It is ready." The gallows, a raw timber frame that stood in the center of town, a stark and permanent reminder of the finality of frontier justice. Now it was clean, oiled, and waiting. For whom the question hung in the freezing air, and Abigail knew the answer with a sickening certainty. Luce left as quickly as she had come, a fleeting shadow against the darkening landscape. That night, the wind howled around the cabin, rattling the window frames. A prelude to the coming storm. The children were asleep, tucked safely in the loft, oblivious to the new and urgent danger. The tension in the small room was unbearable, a physical presence that made it hard to breathe. Abigail could not bear the silence any longer. She stood up from her chair by the fire and faced Eli. who was standing by the window, staring out into the blackness. "No more," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "No more secrets." "Eli, I have a right to know. That woman told you they are preparing the gallows. I will not live in the dark while a noose is being readied for my husband. I will not raise these children under the shadow of a past that could get us all killed. You have to tell me. You have to tell me everything." He turned from the window, and in the flickering firelight she saw the profound weariness in his face. He looked at her, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her, not as a convenience or a helper, but as a partner. The wall of his silence did not crumble, but a door opened in it. "You are right," he said, his voice heavy. "You do have a right to know." He took a deep breath, the sound of it lost in the rising shriek of the wind. "When the first storm passes, I promise you, I will tell you everything." He looked back out the window, at the first white flakes of snow beginning to swirl in the darkness. "Because it is coming, and we will have to face it together." The storm did not arrive gently. It came as an assault, a sudden and violent erasure of the world. The wind, which had been a low moan for hours, rose to a high, thin scream, the sound of a predator in the peaks. Snow did not fall, it flew sideways, a blinding sheet of white that slapped against the cabin walls and piled in deep, churning drifts against the door. The world beyond the windows vanished, replaced by a roiling chaos of white and gray. The cabin, which had always felt so solid and rooted in the earth, now seemed like a small, fragile boat adrift on a furious sea. Abigail stood on the covered porch, a rough wool shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, the wind tearing at its edges. The cold was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole the breath from her lungs. It was then, in a momentary lull in the gale, that she saw it. Through a thin patch in the swirling snow, far down the trail towards the pass, she saw a smudge of dirty smoke. It was a darker gray against the white, a signal of human presence where none should be. It was the Watcher's fire, now multiplied. A camp. Luz Ortega's warning had come to life in that distant, malevolent haze. They were not just being watched anymore. They were being hunted. The cabin door opened, and Eli stepped out beside her. He did not need to ask what she was looking at. His eyes, accustomed to seeing things at a great distance, found the smoke instantly. His face, already grim, seemed to be carved from the same granite as the mountains around them. Behind them, drawn by the open door and the sudden drop in temperature, the children appeared. May stood in the doorway, her small face a mask of solemn worry, her arms wrapped tightly around a corn-husked doll. Jonah was beside her, his expression fierce and old, his hands gripping a heavy, long-barreled flintlock rifle that was almost as tall as he was. It was an ancient relic of a gun, but in his hands it was a statement. He was a defender of this home. Abigail felt a small hand tug at her skirt. She looked down at Little Bird, whose dark eyes were wide with a fear she could not name. Without thinking, Abigail scooped the child into her arms, pulling her inside the warm folds of her shawl. Little Bird buried her face in Abigail's shoulder, a small, warm weight against the terrifying cold. And so they stood, a tableau against the storm, the virgin bride of 18, married to a mountain man with 3 children whose lives were balanced on the edge of a knife. In that moment, with the wind howling and the smoke of their enemies staining the horizon, everything she had feared and everything she had not understood converged. Eli looked from the distant smoke to the children huddled in the doorway, and then to Abigail, holding Little Bird as if she had been born to do so. A profound and terrible sadness settled in his eyes, a grief so old it seemed to have been there forever. He took a deep breath of the freezing air. "It is time you knew," he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried over the scream of the wind. He led them back inside, into the warm, firelit heart of the cabin. He bolted the heavy door, shutting out the storm. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt final, a severing of their small world from the one outside. He had them sit by the hearth, the children on a small bearskin rug, Abigail in a straight-backed chair, still holding Little Bird on her lap. Eli remained standing, a restless shadow against the flickering light. He did not begin right away. He stared into the flames, gathering his words as if they were heavy stones. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of its usual quiet authority. "The first thing you must know," he said, his eyes still fixed on the fire, "is that these are not my children. Not by blood." He paused, and the silence in the room was absolute, deeper even than the roar of the storm outside. "I cannot have children of my own." The words landed in Abigail's mind and lay there, stunning in their simplicity and their pain. It explained a sorrow in him she had never been able to name, a deep, abiding wound that had nothing to do with scars she could see. "I was at a place called Devil's Wash, years ago," he continued, his voice a low monotone. "There was a fight. I took a bad wound. The doctor in the army post, he told me then, 'A man can live a full life.' He said, 'But my line, it ends with me.'" He finally looked up, not at Abigail, but at the children. The love in his eyes was so fierce and so pure, it was painful to behold. "Their father, his name was not Aniyazi. He was Navajo, and he was my brother. Not by blood. We chose it. We swore an oath. My life was his, and his was mine." A flicker of warmth, a distant memory of a better time, touched his face before vanishing. He was a leader among his people, a wise man. He believed in peace. He tried to make a treaty with the government, to keep the land for his people to live on. But the land he lived on had water, and it had grass, and it was in the direct path of the railroad that Amos Kincaid wanted to build. He began to pace, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Pike was not a marshal then. He was working for the railroad, hired muscle with a tin star. He and his men came to Yazie's camp. They said they wanted to talk about the treaty, about the boundary markers. It was a lie. It was an ambush. His voice broke. Just for a second, a raw edge of fury and grief. They called it a skirmish, said the Navajo attacked them. They murdered him. They murdered his wife. They murdered anyone who stood in their way. All for a piece of paper, a surveyor's map that Kincaid and Pike had drawn up to steal the land. Abigail's heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. She looked at May, Jonah, and Little Bird, who were listening with a solemn stillness, as if hearing a story they already knew in their bones. "I was hunting nearby," Eli said. "I heard the shots. By the time I got there, it was over. I was too late to save him, but I was not too late for them." He stopped and looked at the three children, his gaze encompassing them all. "I found May hiding in a storeroom. Jonah was under his mother's body, and Little Bird, she was in her cradle, not making a sound. I carried them out of there. I am all they have left." The pieces fell into place, sharp and terrible. The bounty hunters, Old Crow's words, the unsent letter, the constant, weary watchfulness in Eli's eyes. He was not just a quiet mountain man. He was a guardian, a fugitive hiding the living evidence of a massacre. "The proof," he said, his voice dropping lower. Yazie had a ledger, the real one, from the government surveyor, before Pike got to him. It shows the true boundaries, and he had drawn a map, marking where Pike and his men had moved the stakes to make the railroad's claim look legal. I took them, the ledger and the map. They are the only things that can prove what Pike and Kincaid did, and they know I have them. That is what they are after. The land, yes, but they need to bury the truth. They need to bury these children." He finally stopped pacing and looked directly at Abigail. The weariness in his face was immense, but underneath it was a flicker of something else, a desperate hope. "I tried to raise them on my own, to keep them safe, but I was just one man. Pike has the law in his pocket and Kincaid has the money. I knew I could not do it alone forever. I needed a partner, a wife, someone to make this look like a real family, to give us cover. I sent the letter to the agency. I was not looking for a housekeeper. Abigail, I was looking for someone strong enough to help me carry this. Someone brave enough to stand with us. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. And then you came. The world tilted and then settled again, horribly, finally, into this new shape. A hot wave of anger rose in her. He had lied to her. He had brought her into the heart of a blood feud without her knowledge or consent. He had made her a target. But as she looked at him, at this honorable, broken man who had taken on the weight of the world to keep a promise to a dead friend, the anger dissolved. It was washed away by a great slow wave of sorrow and a fierce, burning compassion. She looked down at Little Bird, who had fallen asleep in her arms, her small face peaceful and trusting. She looked at May, whose eyes were filled with tears she would not let fall. She looked at Jonah, who had moved to stand beside Eli, a silent, miniature soldier. They were not his children by blood. They were his children by choice, by honor, and in the past months, without even realizing it, they had become hers too. She made her choice. It was not even a choice. Really, it was a simple, absolute truth. She belonged here. Slowly, she stood up, still holding the sleeping child. She walked to May and Jonah. She knelt down and wrapped her free arm around both of them, pulling them into a fierce embrace. She held them tight, the three of them and the sleeping baby, a small, defiant circle against the world. "We are a family," she whispered into May's hair, the words a vow. She looked up at Eli over the heads of the children. He was watching her, his face stripped bare of all its defenses, his soul visible in his eyes. She saw his grief, his fear, and his shame, but she also saw his strength and his unwavering love. She let go of the older children and walked towards him, Little Bird still a warm bundle in her arms. She stood before him, so close she could feel the heat from his body. She raised her free hand and gently touched his cheek, his skin rough with weather and worry. Then she leaned in and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, but of allegiance. It was short and trembling, tasting of the cold air and a shared, terrifying resolve. It was a desperate, silent promise made in the heart of a raging storm. When she pulled back, the space between them was no longer filled with secrets, but with a new and fragile understanding. Without a word, he reached into his shirt and pulled out the small deerskin pouch. He opened it and poured the contents into his palm. 3 small, smooth stones of brilliant turquoise, the color of a summer sky in a gentler land. "Yazzie gave these to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "One for each of his children. He said they hold the spirit of the sky, that they keep the wearer safe and at peace." He gently took her hand and placed the stones in her palm, closing her fingers around them. "I want you to keep them. For them. For us." Abigail looked down at the stones, their coolness a strange comfort against her skin. They were more than stones. They were a history, a trust, and a future. She closed her hand tightly, the sharp edges pressing into her flesh. Outside, the storm howled. But inside the small cabin, a quiet resolve had settled. The secret was out. The lines were drawn, and they would face what was coming. Together. The confession did not bring peace. It brought a terrible, sharpened clarity. The storm that raged outside was matched by a controlled tempest of activity within the cabin. The secret was no longer a weight. It was a weapon they now had to learn how to wield against an approaching enemy. There was no time for shock or for anger. There was only time for survival. Eli moved with a quiet, deadly purpose, his grief locked away behind a mask of grim efficiency. "Abigail," he said, his voice a low command that cut through the howl of the wind. "The root cellar. Take them down. Take blankets, water, and enough food for 2 days. Bar the door from the inside. Do not open it for any reason, not even for my voice. I will knock 3 times, then pause, then twice more. That is the only signal you will answer." Abigail nodded. her fear a cold knot in her stomach. But her hands were steady. She gathered May and Jonah, her voice a calm whisper. "We are going to play a game. We will make a camp in the cellar, like a bear's den for the winter. We must be very, very quiet." May's eyes were wide and old. She understood this was no game. Jonah, however, simply nodded and went to fetch the heaviest quilt. Abigail led them to the thick trap door in the corner of the main room, the smell of damp earth and potatoes rising to meet them. She helped them down the short ladder into the cool, absolute darkness, then passed down the supplies. Before she closed the door, she looked at Eli. He was checking his rifle, his movements fluid and economical. Beside him, a figure had materialized from the storm, shaking snow from a heavy coat. Luz Ortega had returned, her face set and serious, a repeating rifle in her hands. She had not been gone long, merely circling back to watch their flank. "So go," Eli said to Abigail, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. It was not an order, but a plea, a transfer of trust. She was the guardian of the future. He and Luz were the keepers of the gate. She pulled the heavy door closed, plunging her and the children into a world of darkness and muffled sound. The roar of the storm, now a distant, subterranean rumble. She slid the heavy wooden bar into place. Above them, Eli and Luz worked without speaking, a partnership forged in shared dangers. They barred the windows, leaving only small slits to shoot from. Then they slipped out the back door, two ghosts swallowed by the white fury of the storm. They did not head for the cabin's immediate perimeter. Eli knew these men would be expecting a direct defense. They were hunters, and the best way to defeat a hunter is to become the prey they cannot see. He led Luz towards Deadman's Pass, the narrow, treacherous trail that was the only direct approach to the hollow. The bounty hunters, overconfident and blinded by the snow, would be funneled into it. In the howling darkness, Eli and Luz worked with the terrain. They were not building fortifications. They were setting snares, a length of rawhide tied to a heavy, deadfall log. A series of deep pits dug in a snowdrift where the trail narrowed, their bottoms lined with sharpened stakes. They were simple, brutal traps, designed to break the momentum of an attack, to sow confusion and fear. They had just finished when they heard the first shots. The hunters had reached the edge of the clearing and opened fire on the dark, silent cabin, expecting to flush their quarry. Eli and Luz circled back, using the storm as cover, and took up positions in a rocky outcrop that overlooked the pass. The attack, when it came, was clumsy and arrogant. 6 riders emerged from the trees, moving single file into the pass. They were dark shapes against the swirling snow, their faces wrapped in scarves, their rifles held ready. They expected a man defending a cabin. They did not expect the mountain itself to fight back. The first horse screamed as it found a pit, its legs snapping with a sickening crack that was almost lost in the wind. The rider was thrown, vanishing into the deep snow. Confusion rippled through the line. A second man urged his horse forward, only to trigger the deadfall. The massive log swung down from the darkness, a pendulum of destruction, sweeping him and his mount from the trail. The remaining 4 men dismounted, firing wildly into the darkness. Muzzle flashes lit the blizzard in brief, strobing bursts of orange. It was then that Eli and Luz opened fire from their perch above. Their shots were not wild. They were measured and precise. One of the hunters cried out and fell. Another scrambled for cover behind a boulder, only to have his leg find a smaller snare, a loop of wire that tightened, pulling his feet from under him and leaving him exposed. It was in that moment of chaos, with the gunfire echoing off the canyon walls, that the mountain finally answered. The sound began as a low, deep rumble, a vibration felt in the bones more than heard with the ears. It grew with terrifying speed into a deafening roar, a sound of immense and final power that was not thunder and was not the wind. It was the sound of the world coming apart. Eli grabbed Luz's arm, pulling her back against the rock face. avalanche. The entire snow-laden slope above the pass, loosened by the vibration of the gunfire, gave way. A tidal wave of snow, rock, and ice descended into the narrow canyon. It did not just fall, it exploded downwards, a white, churning monster that devoured everything in its path. Trees snapped like twigs, boulders were tossed aside like pebbles. The remaining bounty hunters, their rifles and their greed suddenly meaningless, were simply erased, swallowed by the roaring, irresistible force of nature. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. An unnatural silence fell over the pass, a silence made heavier by the ringing in their ears. The snow was still falling, but gently now, as if to cover the fresh, violent scar on the landscape. Where the pass had been, there was now a massive, churning field of snow and debris. As dawn broke, gray and cold, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, buried in a deep and silent blanket of white. Eli and Luce made their way down into the devastation. It was a graveyard, a horse's head here, the splintered stock of a rifle there. Of the 3 men caught in the slide, there was no sign. They were buried deep, their final resting place chosen by the mountain. Of the other 3, one was dead, his body already stiffening in the cold. One was the man with the broken leg, moaning and delirious, and the third, the one caught in the wire snare, was trying to crawl away, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. It was then that 2 more figures appeared, struggling through the deep snow. It was Dr. Mercy, his face etched with worry, and with him, Abigail. After hours in the dark, she had heard the avalanche and then the profound silence that followed. Ignoring Eli's command, she had unbarred the door. Needing to know, she had found the tracks leading to the doctor's cabin and had gone for help, driven by a desperate fear for what she would find upon her return. Dr. Mercy, without a moment's hesitation, went to the man with the broken leg, his medical bag already in hand. He was a doctor first. The reasons for the injury did not matter. As he knelt, trying to splint the man's leg near the unstable edge of a newly formed precipice, the ground, weakened by the slide, gave way. The bounty hunter screamed as he slid towards the edge. The doctor, in a purely instinctual act of healing and preservation, grabbed for him, trying to pull him back. For a moment, he held on, his old muscles straining, but the man was heavy, and the ground was slick with ice. They both went over. Eli and Abigail screamed in unison. They scrambled to the edge, peering into the chasm. The bounty hunter was gone. But 10 feet down, Dr. Mercy had managed to grab onto the twisted root of a pine tree, his body dangling precariously over the drop. His face was a mask of pain, his left eye a bloody ruin where it had struck a sharp branch on his way down. Working together, Eli and Abigail used a rope to haul the old doctor back to safety. He was alive, but battered and bleeding. He had saved a man's life, for a few moments, and it had cost him an eye. While Eli tended to the doctor, Abigail's attention was drawn to the other survivor, the one with the snared leg. He was conscious, his eyes wide with pain and terror. He stared at her, expecting a final, fatal bullet. Abigail looked at this man, this enemy who had come to destroy her family, and she felt nothing but a profound and weary sadness. She went back to the cabin and returned with a flask of whiskey and her mother's bag of remedies. She knelt in the snow beside him. "A man's life is a man's life," she said softly, more to herself than to him, as she began to clean and bind his wound, no matter the price on his head. They took the prisoner back to the cabin, tied to a chair by the fire, with his legs splinted and a belly full of hot coffee and whiskey. His bravado was gone, replaced by a chattering fear. It was Pike, he confessed, his voice shaking. "He told us McKenna had a warrant on him for an old crime, said we'd be deputized, but that ain't the truth of it." He looked around the cabin, at the children who had emerged, silent and watchful, from the cellar. "He wants this land. He said the railroad needs it. He's coming himself in a few days. He's got a paper, a legal order. Says this entire hollow is to be confiscated for the good of the territory. Says it is all perfectly legal." The words hung in the air, more chilling than the winter cold. They had survived the guns and the avalanche. They had won the battle in the snow. But a new front had just opened. Pike was not just using bullets anymore. He was using the law. They had held the cabin. Their small family was safe. For now. But as Abigail looked from the exhausted face of her husband to the stoic, one-eyed profile of Dr. Mercy, she knew that the blood on the snow was only the beginning. The bigger fight, the one for their very existence, was still to come. The law was a piece of paper. Pike's threat was not an empty one. It was a promise written in the cold, precise language of confiscation and eminent domain. They had won the battle of blood and snow, but the war had moved to a field where rifles were useless. Their only shield was another piece of paper, the surveyor's ledger, its pages filled with the neat, honest script of a dead man and the hand-drawn map that told the true story of the boundary stakes. These were their only weapons now. They left the prisoner, his leg splinted and his spirit broken, in the care of Dr. Mercy. The doctor, a clean white bandage now covering his left eye, simply nodded, his one good eye conveying a universe of grim understanding. Luce would stay as well, a silent guardian watching from the high ridges, her rifle a promise that the hollow would not be left undefended. The children were the hardest to leave. Abigail knelt in the snow, hugging each of them tightly. "We are just going to town to sort out some paperwork," she told them, her voice a low, steady murmur that belied the frantic beating of her heart. "Dr. Mercy is here, and Luce will be close by." "You be good for May." Jonah nodded solemnly, while May simply wrapped her arms around Abigail's neck, a fierce, silent embrace that spoke of her fear. The journey down to Silver Gulch was a descent into a different kind of wilderness. The snow was deep, and the air was sharp with a cold that felt personal. Eli was silent, his focus on the trail, but Abigail could feel the tension radiating from him. He had placed the precious ledger and map inside a carefully oiled leather satchel, which he never let leave his side. It was a tangible weight between them on the wagon seat, the physical manifestation of their hope and their peril. Silver Gulch was subdued under its blanket of fresh snow, the usual raucous energy muffled and quieted, but the eyes that followed them as they walked down the main street were as sharp as ever. News of the avalanche in Dead Man's Pass had trickled down, laced with rumor and speculation. They were no longer just the reclusive mountain man and his mail-order bride. They were survivors of a mysterious and deadly conflict. The circuit judge, a man named Hargrove, was holding court in the town's largest saloon, the only building big enough to accommodate the proceedings and the curious onlookers. The room smelled of stale beer, wet wool, and simmering animosity. A makeshift bench had been set up at one end, and Judge Hargrove, a portly man with a weary expression and a stain on his vest, presided over the murmuring crowd. The town council was assembled beside him, a collection of merchants and ranchers whose faces were carefully blank. Marshal Pike stood near the judge, his arms crossed, a look of serene confidence on his handsome face. He was not a defendant here. He was an officer of the court, the very image of law and order. Eli stepped forward, the leather satchel in his hand. He spoke in a low, clear voice, his words simple and direct. He spoke of his claim to Aspen Hollow, a claim properly filed and paid for. He spoke of the railroad survey and of a discrepancy. He opened the satchel and presented the ledger. "This is the official surveyor's book for this district, Your Honor," he said, "and this is a map, drawn by the surveyor himself, showing the original boundary stakes for the railroad's right-of-way. They do not include my land." Judge Hargrove took the documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. For a moment, a flicker of hope ignited in Abigail's chest. The truth was there, in black and white. It was undeniable. The judge studied the papers, and then he looked up, his gaze sweeping over the town council. Abigail saw the slight shake of a head from one man, a downward glance from another. A silent, invisible current passed through the room, a current of money and influence and fear. Kincaid's presence was here, as palpable as the cold. Pike stepped forward, his voice smooth as polished wood. "Your Honor, with all due respect to Mr. McKenna, this is a distraction. The issue at hand is the legal order of confiscation for the Territorial Railroad, an entity vital to our collective prosperity. Mr. McKenna's personal maps are irrelevant. The official plat is on file with the land office. As for this ledger," he picked it up, his fingers smudging the ink. "Who knows where it came from? It is an unsubstantiated document, perhaps even a forgery, brought forth by a man known for his solitary and uncooperative nature." The judge looked from Pike to Eli. He looked at the ledger in his hands. He looked at the hard, unblinking faces of the councilmen. And in that moment, Abigail saw him fold. The weariness in his face deepened into a kind of resigned defeat. "Mr. McKenna," he said, his voice heavy, "the court acknowledges your concerns. However, the order of confiscation is a legal instrument of the territorial authority. This court, a circuit court, does not have the jurisdiction to overturn it. Your claim must be taken up with the authorities in Denver. For now, the order stands." It was over, just like that. The law had looked at the truth and turned its head. Eli stood frozen for a second, the useless satchel hanging from his hand. He had offered them proof, and they had dismissed it as an inconvenience. He said nothing. He simply turned, took Abigail's arm, and led her out of the saloon, the murmurs of the crowd following them like a swarm of insects. They were halfway down the street when the second attack came. It was not with guns, but with words, which were in their own way just as cruel. A group of the town's more respectable women, their faces pinched with piety and malice, blocked their path. "There she is," one of them said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "The girl who thinks she can play mother to a half-wild brood." Another one stepped forward, her eyes cold, barely a woman herself, 18 years old, and already shacked up with a mountain hermit and his children. She said the word as if it were an obscenity. "It is a disgrace to this community." Abigail felt a hot flush of shame, followed by a cold, hard anger. She looked at their faces, twisted with a self-righteous certainty. They saw her as a fallen woman, a fool, an outcast. They saw the children as a stain. She thought of May's fierce loyalty, Jonah's quiet strength, Little Bird's innocent laughter. They were more real, more decent than any of these sharp-tongued gossips. She felt Eli's hand tighten on her arm, ready to pull her away, to shield her. But Abigail stood her ground. She looked at the woman who had spoken, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. It was a smile that held no humor, only a weary, hard-won wisdom. "You need not worry yourselves on my account. Ladies," she said, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the cold air. "The children are teaching me very quickly." The women were stunned into silence, their mouths agape. They had expected tears or shame or a shrill defense. They did not know what to do with this quiet, unassailable dignity. Abigail walked past them, her head held high, leaving them standing in a dumbfounded circle in the middle of the snowy street. They were preparing the wagon to leave when Luce found them, appearing like a shadow from between two buildings. Her face was grim. "I heard what happened with the judge," she said, her voice low. "It went as I expected. Kincaid owns this town. You will never get a fair hearing here." "Then what do we do?" Abigail asked, her voice tight with desperation. "You do what the judge said," Luce replied. "You go to Denver. You take the ledger and the map to the federal court. They are the only ones with the power to challenge a territorial order backed by a man like Kincaid." She looked from Eli to Abigail, her gaze steady. "But you need to understand what that means. The trail to Denver in winter is not a Sunday ride. It crosses Ute territory, and they are not feeling friendly these days. The passes will be choked with snow and ice, and you can be sure that Pike and Kincaid will not let you get there. They will send men, not to arrest you, to make sure you and that ledger disappear forever. The choice was a brutal one. To stay meant losing everything. To go meant risking everything. That night, back in the hollow, the weight of that choice settled over the small cabin. The children were asleep. Dr. Mercy was resting in his own cabin nearby. A profound quiet had fallen, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind in the pines. Eli sat staring into the flames. His shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to bone deep. He looked defeated. All his strength, all his skill in the wilderness, was useless against the slow, grinding corruption of the law. Abigail went to him and sat on the floor at his feet, resting her head against his knee. They sat in silence for a long time. "I never thought I would have this," he said at last, his voice so quiet she could barely hear him. "A home, a family." He took a shuddering breath. "After Devil's Wash, after the doctor told me, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I did not deserve it. A man who cannot give his wife children, who cannot carry on his name. He is only half a man." It was the deepest and most painful of his secrets, a shame he had carried in silence for years. It was the reason he had hidden himself away on this mountain, the reason he believed he was unworthy of happiness. Abigail reached up and placed her hand flat on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, rhythmic beat. "You are wrong, Eli," she whispered, her voice fierce with a conviction that came from the very center of her being. "You have been a father to those children in every way that matters. You have protected them and taught them and loved them. You have given them a home. Family is not counted in blood. It is counted in the people we choose to stand beside, especially when the world is against us." He looked down at her, and in the firelight, she saw tears glistening in his eyes. He slowly covered her hand with his own, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. In that moment, the last wall between them crumbled into dust. They were no longer two separate people bound by a contract and a crisis. They were one. Abigail rose and went to the small trunk at the foot of her bed. From beneath her spare dress, she pulled out the wedding veil. It was a simple thing, of plain white netting, already creased and bearing the faint stains of her long journey. It was a symbol of a life that had never been, a promise of a quiet, ordinary marriage that had been a lie from the start. It represented the girl she had been, the one who had signed her name on a piece of paper out of desperation. She held it in her hands for a moment. Then, with a single, decisive motion, she tore it in two. The sound of the ripping fabric was loud in the quiet room. It was the sound of a contract being broken, of a past being discarded. She walked back to Eli. He had gotten a shallow cut on his forearm during the journey, a scrape from a tree branch. It was nothing serious, but she took one half of the torn veil and began to wrap it carefully around his arm, a makeshift, purely symbolic bandage. "The old agreement is done," she said softly. The flimsy white netting, once a symbol of a bride for sale, was now a white band on the arm of a warrior, a banner for their shared cause. From now on, we stand together. The journey to Denver was a pilgrimage through a frozen hell. They started before dawn, leaving the hollow under the watchful, one-eyed gaze of Dr. Mercy and the silent promise of Luz's rifle high in the rocks. Their first stop was the edge of Silver Gulch, at the dark, smoky forge of Old Crow, while the sky was still a bruised purple. The blacksmith, moving with an ancient, unhurried grace, performed a small but vital miracle of survival. He took Eli's horseshoes and, with the rhythmic clang of his hammer, forged small, sharp studs, or caulks, into them. "Ice does not forgive," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the hiss of hot metal quenching in dark water. "A horse's footing is a man's life." He worked by the light of the forge, a powerful, solitary figure creating a defense against the treachery of the trail. He asked for no payment, but as they left, he pressed a small, heavy pouch into Abigail's hand. It was filled with jerky and hardtack, a blessing for the road. With the specially shod horses, They made better time than Abigail thought possible. But the journey was still a brutal test of endurance. The world was a vast, silent expanse of white, broken only by the dark skeletons of pine trees and the jagged upthrust of rock. They traveled through deep drifts that threatened to swallow the wagon, and across wide, wind-scoured plains where the cold was a physical blade against their skin. At night, they made small, smokeless fires in the shelter of rocky overhangs. The nights were the worst. The cold was a living thing, seeping through their blankets, and the silence was filled with unseen presences. One night, a pack of wolves, their eyes glowing like green embers in the darkness just beyond the firelight, shadowed their camp for hours. They did not attack, but their patient, hungry vigil was a chilling reminder of how fragile their existence was, how easily they could be consumed by this unforgiving land. In those long, dark hours, Abigail and Eli spoke little, but a new and profound intimacy grew between them, a bond forged in shared fear and a silent, stubborn will to live. They were on the 4th day, navigating a high mountain pass in a blinding storm of sleet. When they saw the bridge, it was a long, rickety-looking wooden structure spanning a deep, ice-choked gorge. It was the only way across, and standing at the far end, like specters in the gray, swirling ice, were Marshal Silas Pike and 4 of his men. There was no surprise. Pike had known they would have to come this way. He had chosen his ground. There was no retreat. The trail behind them was too narrow to turn the wagon.
"This is it, Abby,"
Eli said, his voice grim. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard.
"Get down in the wagon bed. Stay down."
The first shot cracked through the hiss of the sleet, splintering the wood of the wagon seat where Abigail had been sitting a moment before. Eli returned fire. His shot aimed not to kill, but to drive them to cover. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the shots echoing flat and dead in the heavy, frozen air. Abigail huddled in the wagon bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was not a fighter. She had no weapon. But as the battle raged, a cold, clear-eyed calm settled over her. She would not be helpless. She looked around, her eyes scanning their surroundings, searching for an advantage, for anything. Her gaze fell on a thick coil of rope tied to the side of the wagon, and then to the bridge's construction. It was old, held together with massive iron bolts. Near their end of the bridge, a heavy, disused iron pulley, once used for hauling timbers during construction, was still bolted to the main support beam. An idea, desperate and dangerous, took root in her mind, while Eli kept the men pinned down with steady, accurate fire. Abigail crawled from the wagon. The sleet was a torrent of tiny needles against her face. She uncoiled the heavy rope. Keeping low, she scrambled to the edge of the bridge, her fingers numb with cold as she threaded the rope through the rusty pulley. She wrapped the other end around the axle of their heavy wagon. It was a simple machine, a lever. "Eli," she screamed over the gunfire. "The wagon! We have to move the wagon." He understood instantly. While he laid down a volley of covering fire, he urged the horses backward. The animals strained, their specially shod hooves finding purchase on the slick rock. The rope grew taut. The old iron pulley groaned in protest. The massive support beam of the bridge began to creak, the sound of wood fibers tearing, a high, agonizing scream that was louder than the storm. With a final, shattering crack, the main support on their side of the bridge gave way. Half of the bridge did not collapse into the gorge, but sagged violently downwards, tearing away from the bank and leaving a wide, impassable gap. The 2 men who had been closest to their side screamed as they slid down the precipitous angle, their rifles flying from their hands. They managed to catch hold of the splintered timbers, left dangling over the chasm. Pike and his other 2 men were trapped on the far side, their avenue of attack completely destroyed. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, broken only by the wind and the terrified cries of the men hanging from the broken bridge. Pike stood, his face a mask of disbelief and pure fury. His position suddenly and impossibly reversed. He raised his pistol to fire one last, vengeful shot. But Eli was faster. A single shot from his rifle kicked Pike's pistol from his hand, sending it spinning into the gorge below. The fight was over. They left Pike and his remaining men stranded, a problem for the spring thaw to solve, and continued their journey. Denver was a shock to the senses. After weeks in the white, silent wilderness, the city was a chaotic explosion of noise, color, and people. It was a city of brick and stone, of ambition and power, a world away from the log cabins and dusty streets of Silver Gulch. They found their way to the federal courthouse, a new, imposing building that smelled of plaster and fresh paint, a temple to a different kind of law. Their appearance, haggard and trail-worn, combined with the urgency in Eli's voice and the precious leather satchel he carried, was enough to get them an audience with a clerk, who in turn, after one look at the official surveyor's seal in the ledger, brought them before federal judge Alistair Wright. He was a stern, white-haired man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He listened to their story in his chambers, his expression unreadable. When they were done, he sat in silence for a full minute. "Marshal Pike is a territorial officer," he said at last, his voice a deep baritone. "And Amos Kincaid is one of the most powerful men in this territory. You are making a very serious accusation." "We have proof, sir," Abigail said, her voice finding a strength she did not know it possessed. Judge Wright looked from the ledger to their faces, and he saw something that the circuit judge had not the undeniable weight of truth. "Indeed," he said, "I am calling an emergency session in 1 hour." The courtroom was vast and quiet. When the hearing began, Luz Ortega, who had arrived in Denver a day ahead of them by a faster route, was called to testify, cool and professional. She presented the map and the ledger, explaining the discrepancies in the survey lines, her voice calm and factual. The next witness was Dr. Mercy. He had made the arduous journey himself, a day behind them, refusing to be left out of the final reckoning. He walked to the stand, his face grim, the white bandage over his eye a stark and powerful accusation. He spoke of the attack on the Hollow, of the bounty hunters who claimed to be deputies, of the climate of fear Pike had created. He was the voice of the community, a testament to the human cost of Kincaid's greed. Then, Old Crow was called. The old blacksmith stood before the judge, a figure of quiet, ancient dignity. He spoke of the land, of the boundary markers he had seen with his own eyes as a young man. He described the stone cairns the Navajo had used and how they had been replaced by the railroad's wooden stakes, moved a 1/4 of a mile west to encompass Aspen Hollow's spring. He was the memory of the land itself, and his testimony gave the map a voice. Finally, Judge Wright examined the ledger himself, page by page. It was then he found it. Tucked into the back, on a page of miscellaneous notes, was a hastily scrawled directive, a note from the field. It detailed the plan to clear the Navajo from Devil's Wash, to remove them by any means necessary to secure the land for the new survey line. And at the bottom, a clear, unmistakable signature, Silas Pike. It was not a legal order. It was a death warrant. The judge held up the page. "Marshal Pike," he said, his voice ringing with cold authority. Pike, who had been brought to Denver to give his own report, stood in the courtroom, his face pale, his usual confidence gone. "Is this your signature?" Pike stared at the paper, at his own handwriting condemning him. The trap he had laid for another had finally sprung on him. The polished mask of the lawman shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered animal beneath. He did not answer. He turned and bolted, shoving aside a bailiff, running for the courtroom doors, for the open street, for a freedom he no longer deserved. Eli, who was standing near the door, instinctively raised his rifle. For a single, stretched second, Pike was framed in his sights, a clear and easy shot. The face of Nat Ani Yazi flashed in his mind, the memory of blood on the ground, the feel of a dying man's hand in his. A lifetime of grief and anger welled up, demanding vengeance. But he did not shoot. He lowered the rifle. He had not come all this way, fought through the snow and the ice and the corruption, to become the very thing he was fighting against.
"Let the law have him,"
he said, his voice steady. Bailiffs tackled Pike before he reached the street. The fight was over. Judge Wright issued the order immediately. A federal warrant was issued for the arrest of Marshal Silas Pike on charges of conspiracy and murder. A full investigation was launched into the business practices of Amos Kincaid and the Territorial Railroad. And, most importantly, an injunction was placed on the confiscation order. Aspen Hollow was safe. The land, the judge declared, would be held in trust, its status to be decided by a new treaty that would respect the claims of all its inhabitants, settler and native alike. Justice, which had been sleeping for so long, had finally awoken. The return journey from Denver was the same trail in reverse. Yet the entire world had changed. The snow-choked passes that had seemed like monstrous adversaries on the way out were now just mountains, their silent, white-clad slopes beautiful in their indifference. The wind still cut to the bone, but it no longer felt like the breath of an enemy. It was just the wind. They were not fleeing anymore. They were going home. Their quiet hope, however, shattered as they reached the final rise overlooking Aspen Hollow. A dark, ugly scar marred the pristine white of the valley floor. The cabin still stood, but it was wounded. A section of the porch had been torn away, and one corner of the roof was blackened, the logs beneath charred and scorched. It was the parting gift of a defeated man, a final, petty act of malice from Pike's scattered men before they had fled the territory for good. As they drew closer, the cabin door flew open. May, Jonah, and Little Bird came tumbling out, their small faces a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. They ran to the wagon, their cries lost in the wind, and threw themselves at Abigail and Eli. Behind them, Dr. Mercy emerged, his one eye filled with a fierce, protective light. He held a shotgun, its barrel still smoking faintly. They had been defended. The damage was more than just cosmetic. The fire had burned through a section of the wall, leaving a gaping blackened hole that let in the wind and the cold. Inside, the main room was a chaotic mess of overturned furniture and scattered belongings. But the heart of the home, the great stone hearth and the cast-iron pot, was untouched. Despair was a luxury they could not afford. As Eli began to assess the structural damage, a sound drifted up from the trail below the rhythmic clop of horses and the rumble of a heavy wagon. It was Ben Cole, his barrel chest puffed out against the cold, his wagon laden with fresh-cut pine planks and tools. Beside him sat Hattie, her lap full of bundled blankets and a basket overflowing with bread and smoked ham. "Heard you might have some need for neighboring," Ben called out, his voice a warm and welcome sound in the cold. Still Air took the liberty of closing up the mercantile for the day. They were not the only ones. Within the hour, Luz Ortega appeared from the high ridges, her rifle slung over her shoulder, a coil of good rope in her hand. Old Crow arrived on foot, a heavy sack of iron fittings and nails on his back, his ancient face set in lines of grim determination. The community, the small, scattered collection of decent souls that Pike and Kincaid had tried to break, had come to stand with them. The rebuilding of the house was a symphony of shared purpose. The rhythmic rasp of Ben's saw, the sharp, definitive reports of Old Crow's hammer, the quiet instructions from Luce on how to brace the weakened wall. Eli worked with a silent, focused energy, his hands sure and strong as he fitted the new planks into place. Abigail was everywhere at once, clearing debris, brewing pot after pot of hot coffee, tending to the children and ensuring a steady supply of Hattie's bread and ham made its way to the workers. The air, which had smelled of ash and defeat, slowly began to fill with the clean, sharp, hopeful scent of new pine. "Our home smells of new pine now," Abigail said to Hattie as they stood watching the men hoist a new support beam into place. Hattie simply squeezed her hand, a gesture of solidarity that said more than words ever could. By evening, The work was done. The hole in the wall was patched. The porch was rebuilt, stronger than before, and a temporary cover was secured over the damaged roof. The cabin was scarred, but it was whole again. It was home. That night, they gathered around the hearth. The fire danced and crackled, casting a warm, golden glow on the faces of their small, unlikely family and the friends who had become its foundation. The children, exhausted but content, were curled together on the bearskin rug, their eyes heavy with sleep. Old Crow rose from his seat by the fire. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, and in his hands he held a small, soft leather bundle. He stood before Abigail and Eli. "A house is made of wood and stone," he said, his voice a low rumble, like the sound of the earth itself. "A home is made of promises." He unwrapped the bundle. Lying on the soft deerskin was a bracelet of hammered silver, simple and strong, inlaid with 3 stones of brilliant turquoise. "The silver is the strength you showed. The stones are the lives you protected, their sky, their future." He did not give it to Eli. He took Abigail's hand and fastened the bracelet around her wrist. It was cool and heavy against her skin, a beautiful, tangible weight. It was not a shackle, but an anchor. Ben and Hattie Cole stood up, their faces beaming in the firelight. "We are not preachers or judges," Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we have been witnesses to something true here, and we are proud to stand as witnesses again tonight." Eli turned to Abigail. He took her hands, his rough palms gently enclosing hers and the cool silver of the bracelet. He did not have a speech prepared. His words came from a place deeper than thought, a place of profound and humble truth. "Abigail," he began, his voice raspy, "I cannot offer you an easy life. The winters will be hard, and the work will be long. I can only offer you my hands, to help you build and to keep you safe. I can offer you my word, that I will stand by you, and I can offer you my heart, to share the burden and the joy of raising these children." He looked over at the sleeping forms of May, Jonah, and Little Bird. "I swear, before our friends and before this fire, that I will be your husband, and I will be their father, for all of my days." Abigail's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Eli," she said, her fingers tightening around his, "I did not come here seeking a home, but I found one. I did not come here seeking a family, but you have given me one. I swear to be your wife, and to be their mother. I will be their shelter and their comfort, their teacher and their friend. We will raise them with love, until they are old enough and strong enough to choose their own paths in the world." It was a simple ceremony, with no book and no ring, witnessed only by a handful of friends and the silent, listening mountains. But it was more real, more binding, than any contract written in ink. It was a promise sealed not by law, but by love. In the days that followed, a gentle, quiet rhythm returned to Aspen Hollow, but it was a new kind of quiet. It was not the quiet of isolation and secrets, but the deep, contented peace of a family finally secure in its own skin. The pace of life slowed to the turning of the seasons. Abigail would sit with May on the new porch, listening as the girl read aloud from a book of poems Ben Cole had given her. May's voice, once hesitant and small, was now growing confident and clear, painting pictures in the air with words. Jonah, who had once been so silent and fierce, spent his afternoons in the woods, not with a rifle, but with twine and bent saplings. He was learning to build snares, but they were a new kind, taught to him by Old Crow. They were traps that could catch a rabbit or a grouse, holding it safely in a small cage, unharmed, so that he could study it for a while before letting it go. He was learning the ways of the forest, not as a hunter, but as a student, his heart filled with a gentle curiosity instead of a need to kill. And the sound of Little Bird's flute, a simple instrument carved from a river reed, became the music of the hollow. It was a high, sweet, reedy sound, a simple melody that drifted through the aspen trees, a song of pure and untroubled innocence. One bright, cold afternoon, Abigail was sorting through her small wooden trunk. At the very bottom, she found it the other half of her wedding veil. She held the soft, torn netting in her hands, a relic from another lifetime, from a girl who no longer existed. She looked up and saw May and Jonah in the corner of the room, their heads bent together over a book, squinting in the bright shaft of sunlight that streamed through the window. A slow smile spread across Abigail's face. She took the piece of veil and tacked it carefully across the top half of the window pane. It did not block the light, but it softened it, diffusing the harsh glare into a gentle, milky glow. The corner was transformed into a cozy, protected space, a perfect nook for reading, the last remnant of her old life, a symbol of a broken contract, had been repurposed. It was no longer a veil to hide a bride, but a screen to nurture a child's mind. That evening, she and Eli stood on the porch, watching the last of the sun's rays paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of lavender and rose. The air was still and cold, and their breath plumed in front of them. It was a vast and beautiful landscape, still wild, still unforgiving. But it was not empty. "The West is still a harsh place," Abigail said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Eli wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Yes," he said, his voice a low rumble of contentment, "but we have learned how to make it less lonely. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.